Welcome. Thank you for joining Public Funds Public Schools for the fifth event in our webinar series. My name is Jessica Levin. I'm an attorney at Education Law Center and the director of Public Funds Public Schools, which is a collaboration of Education Law Center, the Southern Poverty Law Center, the SPLC Action Fund, and the law firm Munger, Tolles & Olson. PFPS is a national campaign dedicated to ensuring that public funds for education are used to maintain, support, and strengthen our public schools. Visit our website, pfps.org, for more info and sign up for updates on our contact page. Today, we are delighted to host Professor Derek Black of the University of South Carolina, an experienced litigator and widely cited scholar on constitutional and education law and policy, in conversation with Education Law Center's Executive Director, David Chiara, about Professor Black's must-read new book, Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy. The webinar will be recorded and available on PFPS's website. Today's discussion will explore the history of the right to education, its role in promoting our democratic values, and its importance in times of fiscal uncertainty and expanding gaps in educational opportunity. Professor Black will also explain the threat posed to public education and American democracy by private school vouchers and other school privatization measures. After that, we'll open it up to audience questions. We ask that you please use the Q&A feature in Zoom rather than the chat box to submit your questions for our speakers. It's my pleasure now to introduce David Chiara, the Executive Director of Education Law Center. As a practicing civil rights lawyer since 1978, he's litigated on a wide range of social justice issues and has counseled to the plaintiff students in New Jersey's landmark Abbott versus Burke case since 1996. He's litigated to enforce access for low-income students and students of color to an equal and adequate education under state and federal law. He also conducts research, writes, and lectures on education law and policy in such areas as school finance, early education, and school reform. So I'll turn it over to David to introduce Professor Derek Black and discuss Schoolhouse Burning.
Well, thank you, Jessica, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us. I want to first give a shout out to Public Funds Public Schools, a campaign which we've been honored to participate in at Education Law Center for several years now, with our tremendous partners at Southern Poverty Law Center, some of whom are on the call: Catherine Dunn, Bacardi Jackson. The whole team at Southern Poverty Law Center has done an outstanding job, and it's just a wonderful collaboration. Also with the folks at the Munger Tolles firm, we've in a very short period of time, I think, have established a real pushback to the growing spread of vouchers across the country, and some significant victories. So please visit Public Funds Public Schools, pfps.org, for more information. I'm pleased to introduce Derek Black. Derek is a good friend, and we've had many therapy sessions, as he called it. We're going to have one today to talk about the state of public education in the United States. Eric is the Ernest F. Hollings Chair in Constitutional Law at the University of South Carolina. I would commend to you his book, his prologue in his book, actually, which I found profoundly moving, which he told me that he had to be urged to write it, which is his personal story. Derek grew up in Clinton, Tennessee, a rural part of Tennessee, and attended public schools in a previously segregated, racially segregated public school system. And he talks in the prologue about how teachers in the Clinton public schools made such an important impact on his life. Growing up in a working class family in a rural area, those schools were really the engine that sent him on to college to study African American studies. His amazing journey then continued to the University of North Carolina Law School. He was at Howard University teaching when I first met Derek some years back, over a decade ago, and now at the University of South Carolina. His book I've talked about how I'd like to write a book if I had the time. Derek has written the book, so I would urge you all to read it. It's a tremendous resource, and it will walk you through the history, the important history of education rights and equity in our country, and the challenges we face today. So welcome, Derek. So let's get started, because we only have a short period of time. for me to ask questions and then to open it up for Q&A. So those of you that want to ask questions, I think you can put them in the chat, and we'll try to take them up towards the end of the hour. So let me start, Derek, by sort of your book. You talk about the founders of our country giving us two gifts. One is democracy, and the other is public schools or public education, and both intertwined and interrelated, obviously. And I think your sort of theory of action going forward is the healthier the public schools, the healthier our democracy. And you go over some of the ups and downs, the tremendous ups and downs we've had in our history about public education, though deeply flawed, but important in educating our children. And you talk about obviously some of the major downs or flaws in our system over our history in terms of access to children based on race, socioeconomic status, gender, and where kids live, cities, towns, or rural communities, and how that impacts on the education that children receive. You also talk about how public education today is in deep crisis, deeper, I think you say, than it's ever been before, which is a really profound, alarming statement. And I want to explore that a little bit more with you. But you point to two main components sparking today's current crisis, which I want to get to. One is that our schools are underfunded and under-resourced, and that our schools are segregated, continue to be segregated, and in some cases even more intensely by both race and poverty. The founders wanted public education, but they left it to the states to provide it. Can you talk about the state's legal obligation to educate children and how that relates to the main problems of funding, segregation in public education? And the question I really want to ask you too to get to is, did the founders make a fundamental mistake by leaving it to the states to provide public education to children, unlike other countries which have national systems of public schooling?
Well, I mean, that's a great way to start, David. And I think, it's been an awkward dance that I've had to play for a few years because it is left to the states. But the thing, you and I have had conversations about it, but the thing I think we have to make clear about is I don't think the states have any choice but to deliver it, right? So that part of what it means to be a Republican form of government, to be a democracy, is to provide public education. And there's not really any teeth or meat on the bones of that, to be quite honest, because, courts said no in San Antonio to sort of any federal regulation. And of course, we've had a lot of sort of purely state regulation. But I do believe, that it's both, right? So that the states have no choice but to do that job. And the problem, I think, is enforcing the state's obligation, right? To me, it's not the problem that it's the feds or the states per se that have the responsibility, but that the buck has to stop somewhere, right? And as you point out, and I've pointed out, those people where the buck is supposed to stop haven't been doing those jobs, and that's in the state legislatures. But I think it's fair enough to say that Congress hasn't been doing its job and insisting that the states fulfill their obligations. So what are the legal remedies to make sure they do that? That's complicated. We won't get into it now, but the Southern Poverty Law Center, for instance, is saying that, and this is part of my research as well, that in 1868, Mississippi was readmitted to the Union on the condition that they never deprive students of the constitutional rights that had just been vested in the Mississippi Constitution. And if Mississippi doesn't live up to that, they're in violation of their terms of readmission to the Union. I think similar points can be made about a lot of states. And so primary responsibility states, and Congress ought to be looking over their shoulders. I mean, I also talk about that in the early period when Congress formed actually a Department of Education right after the Civil War. The idea was to help states do their job, monitor them when they're not, and to share information, right, to sort of make sure that we're building better systems. So, yeah, I think I wouldn't say they made a mistake. I just think that they made a strange marriage that hasn't lived up to maybe our ideals, maybe.
Well, let's talk a little bit about why that is, and that how that's carried down through our history to today, to the problems we see in these 50 state systems, if you will, of public education that form our national system of educating children. You note in the book, you talk a lot in the book about the state constitutions requiring public education, that education has been determined to be a right in many of those states. You called it an inherent function of the state. Then you also say that the constitutions tried to insulate public education from partisan politics in the states. Can you talk about that more? And has that failed? Or is it just part and parcel of the state constitutional framework that we have, where it delegates the responsibility to maintain and support our system of public education to the elected branches of government, governors and state legislatures? Can you talk about the implications of that, both historically and today?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I don't know the right answer to the correct structure to insulate public education from politics, but I do believe that the point was to do so. And maybe we just need to figure a better way to do it. But I think the Pennsylvania Constitutional Convention of 1872 is the best example of this, that they say, look, the state superintendent for education has to be an independent constitutional officer elected by the people. People say, well, that's political, isn't it? No, the reason why they wanted that was they wanted that person removed from the influence of the governor, removed from the influence of the legislature. So that's number one. We need someone who's committed and who's a constitutional officer who can't be hired or fired by any politicians, number one. And the second thing they did in that 1872 Constitution, which is unique amongst all of them, is mandated a specific annual appropriation at that point, which was $1 million, which they thought was an enormous number at that time. And they were very clear that they were putting that number in the Constitution because they couldn't trust the legislature to fairly fund schools. And people said, yeah, but soon enough, $1 million won't be enough. They said, we'll get there. We'll deal with that later. For right now, we need to hold the state's feet to the fire. So I think there is this skepticism, right, in the very earliest days that, in fact, legislators would not live up to their obligations. And how can we create a structure that circumvents that? Come back to South Carolina, for instance, and a lot of your southern states. Poll taxes are dirty words now because we sort of associate them with exclusion of African Americans from the ballot box. But African Americans in South Carolina constitutionalized a poll tax because they knew people would vote, and if they charged them money and they put it in a pot reserved for public schools, they knew that public schools would get it. So again, you have this other attempt to create money that stands outside of outside of the political system. The failure is just that the world's a lot more complicated than that now, right? You can't fund schools on a poll tax, and you can't amend the Constitution every 4 years to put a new number in there. But that intent to isolate is clear, and you see it in the state boards of education as well. I mean, every state kind of has a little bit of a different mixture, but education is constitutionalized not just in the mandate, but actually in the structure of delivery of it as well in most of our states.
So let me come at it this way, I guess, too, is to take it right to the present. And you talk a lot in your book about privatization, both in the form of private school voucher programs and charter schools and the like. So those folks who, as you point out, who fundamentally would like to just get rid of public education and go to more of a private market model. People who are and these are the people that in the past you could think about dismantling the Reconstruction reforms that you talk a lot about post-Civil War that were then dismantled by state legislatures, as you correctly point out, with changing the Constitution in Mississippi and weakening it, and so forth and so on. These folks, it seems to me, understood that they could succeed in their efforts by controlling votes in state capitals. We now have 28 states that have enacted voucher programs, draining millions, close to $1 billion in Florida alone in tax dollars from state budgets. What about that? Have they figured out that the real way to get at public education and weaken it and dismantle it over the last 20 or 30 years is essentially to get the legislatures, to elect to those legislators representatives who would do their bidding?
Yeah, yeah. Long question, easy answer, yes. And I think the problem of democracy here is the enormous disconnect between the people in the halls of power and the voters, right? That, we have our statewide referendum in Arizona, and, 65% of the voters are against charters. And, it's never succeeded on a statewide basis. And I should say vouchers in Arizona. But, charters have failed. There was sort of the big bill, and of course, in Massachusetts, and that failed. They thought they were going to win that. Coming back to the South, in North Carolina, they thought they were going to, charterize the entire state and allow for basically resegregation through the schools. And the governor said, no, I'll veto that, and for obvious reasons. And then they cooked up this crazy scheme whereby North Carolina has this provision that says, well, if the law only applies, to a subset of the state, it's not a general law, and therefore it's not subject to the governor's veto. So they passed this charter bill that's just for these white suburb schools in Charlotte, which is just crazy. Now in Tennessee, you've benefited from the opposite, right? The law has to be uniform as to vouchers, and so it got struck down. But what you have is these folks in power trying to angle every way they can around the will of the voters, to be quite honest, right? I mean, look at the outpouring, look at the marching on the state capitals, in Arizona, West Virginia, North Carolina, Kentucky, on and on, and in North Carolina, electing a new governor, Kentucky electing a new governor, and they're still trying to angle. And that's the thing that has been sadly awakened for me, is that, if we're not angling back, including doing the type of litigation and advocacy that public funds for public schools are doing, we're going to get beat, because they just won't stop. Even the voters don't seem to be able to stop them. And maybe that's the point I'll end on. I was working on a piece that says public education is on the presidential ballot this year for the first time since Richard Nixon, right? And even Nixon wasn't against public schools. He was just against integration or busing. But you have never seen a person get elected to a national platform who at least didn't say he or she was committed to public schools, who didn't at least say, I want to spend more on schools, who didn't at least say, I want to improve academic standards. And we could debate whether NCLB was a good law or not, and ESSA, but you had to be for public schools if you wanted to be president. And this is the first time in history, I believe, that we have someone representing a presidential party who is against public education. And that's part of what I said, that this is a very low and unique moment in American history that I would have thought unthinkable. And so this fall, for not that I doubt we have many conservatives on the phone call, but right, it's not just about, the economy and regulation this year. You got to think about your child's education when you go to the ballot box this year.
So does that reflect that fact that it's on the presidential ballot box? Does that reflect the success, the electoral success in the states, if you will, in so many states where legislatures have embraced the privatization agenda, if you want to call it that, writ large, enacted voucher programs, charter programs, and things like that, so that there's a kind of a sort of a critical mass of energy coming out of the states that's essentially transformed itself into what we now have, Secretary DeVos and President Trump essentially pursuing an anti-public education agenda. Is that what you're talking about? It
is, although I'm not a political scientist to figure out how a movement becomes, but she is she's more unpopular. DeVos is more unpopular than the president, right? She's the most unpopular member of his cabinet. Normally, no one cares about who Secretary of Education is, except for folks like us. She has a larger security detail than anyone in his cabinet. I mean, my goodness, she does not. I mean, yes, there's a critical mass, and that's the word that you're using. So what we do see is a critical mass that I think through primaries, Republican primaries, are able to win their nomination. But I don't actually think, they reflect anything close to more than a third of the population, but yet they are in power. They are in power.
Can you talk a little bit about, one of the things strikes me is about North Carolina and the politics of education in North Carolina and the right to education in North Carolina. There's a state that was, a little over a decade ago, not that long ago, sort of breaking out of the mold of the southern states, really, in terms of investment in public education. They had radically increased the amount of money that was going into schools. They had really started one of the nation's premier early education programs, as you know. And there was, voluntary desegregation in places that was going on, a kind of robust teacher training programs that they had started. And then it all went, downhill. Can you talk about that? And what are the lessons of North Carolina for the nation? And for folks in other states out there that are working in state capitals to try to get their legislatures to comply with their rights to education in their constitutions.
Well, I think one of the things we have to look at and monitor is demographics, right? That, just to reiterate your point, I mean, North Carolina, relatively well funded. I would say Charlotte-Mecklenburg was the best example of school desegregation in the nation's history and the longest standing there. Wake County was the best example in the nation of voluntary socioeconomic integration at the time. And so, North Carolina has a lot going for it. And, the Southern Education Foundation, has done a lot of research for the tip, how low-income students have become the majority in our public schools. And I find it I find it ironic that the very moment that North Carolina begins to tip in a different directions, also that same period in which low-income students become a majority in the public schools, right? And so, and of course, there's also this, what I call the dissent option in these racially integrated areas where a voucher, or in North Carolina, a charter actually becomes the means by which to dissent from integration. That different than many other states in the country, that the charter schools are becoming wider at the same time that the charter schools are becoming more students of color. And so all these, and the legislatures also trying to cement their political power by redrawing voting district lines. And so I encapsulate that and say, look, this is a white middle-income power structure that is trying to insulate itself, right, from a fair fight at the ballot box, and is trying to insulate itself for the responsibility of paying for, quote unquote, other children's education, right? And that is the story of North Carolina. So those are sad lessons. I don't know what the good lesson is, other than, we can't assume the good faith of our leaders towards public education anymore. There's been too much bad faith shown over the last decade to assume, right, that people are coming at this from a good place, because over and over again, they're trying to undermine our public schools, trying to undermine equality and our broader democracy. And that's sort of how I see it. I don't know how you see it in New Jersey, but.
Right. So you're talking about a disconnect, I think, between the ultimate users of public education, which is changing, right? So if you look at who attends public schools in certain states, these states, I mean, in California, 8 million students in public schools, well over half of those children are low income. So you're getting whole state systems which are increasingly poor. I think that's what you're saying, and also students of color. And there's a disconnect between the families and the households and the parents that use those systems now, more and more rely on those systems, and the political power structure, whether it's in Raleigh or in Sacramento or wherever it might be. Is that your point?
That's right. Now you get me fired up, Dave, because you're reminding me of the pauper schools. And I hadn't made this connection to my mind until you keep pressing it. But, all these, ridiculous reformers somehow or another think this is going to create freedom, this is going to create better opportunity, we'll all be better off if we go in our own directions and get in our silos. And in 1870, just to go back to Pennsylvania again, they said, look, we've had pauper schools in our Constitution for a few decades, and it ain't working, number one. There's a lot of kids, white rural kids, working class kids out in the sticks of Pennsylvania that are getting no education, number one. Number two, the public schools are stigmatized. Like, if what you're telling everyone else is that the only public schools out there are the pauper schools, that's not going to work, right? And we have Horace Mann in the background saying, look, the only way for a system of education to work for everyone is for that school system to be for everyone, so that it's not just for the poor kids or the white kids or the black kids or whoever. And so what's ridiculous, what's getting me fired up, that you remind me of it, is that like 150 years ago, people said, you can't run society this way. It's not working. And now we have a group of people saying, oh, we've got a solution. Let's let people go in their different directions, and we'll have, I think what you're saying, basically, David, we'll turn the public schools into the pauper schools again. And if we do that, we will soon enough move backwards to where we were, in the mid 1800s. And we'll, that is a crazy idea, but ultimately that is another historical lesson of the book, I think, now that you're pulling me to it.
And don't we, when you've talked about these problems, when you look at the systems in many states you're describing, don't we sort of have the modern form of that now in so many states, where you have a deep, chronic, severe underfunding of public education in these state systems through these financing formulas and all of that, very low levels. States that cut and then they don't come back from the economic downturns, just not providing the resources. We were just working on a report in Tennessee about the chronic shortages of the teacher workforce across the state, support staff, sort of essential staff in schools that impact. And then also the related problem is it all impacts on schools that are serving higher concentrations of low-income children, more at-risk children, higher poverty communities, and students of color. So don't we have sort of our modern-day form of pauper schools in many of our states that we've got to address?
We'd certainly have to address them, and I think what we might add to that is to say that because of the way the funding formulas are so out of whack, that we have some public schools operating like pauper schools, and then we have other ones operating like private schools, because basically, you buy into the neighborhood, you set whatever you want your local tax rate to be, you fund the type of education you want, and then the rest are just pauper schools, right? So we have this bifurcated, public system, partially pauper, partially somewhat like private. And I don't know that I talk about it in the book, but the secession districts, which Erica Wilson has been writing a lot, had written an article about. We've seen those, and Erica Frankenberg, I think, has done some work on them as well, where we see these white enclaves seceding from their larger, more diverse school systems. And I had pointed out that in Alabama, that I actually attribute part of that secession to the state of Alabama itself, because what it does is create a system of underfunded and segregated public education where ultimately there is extreme competition for a finite number of quality educational opportunities, because the state is not going to fund it across the state. And so what they're really doing is incentivizing wealthy parents or parents with means to say, well, if the state is not going to lift all boats, we're just going to jump off the boat altogether. And hopefully there's a state structure that will allow us to do it and continue to call ourselves public schools, right? The secession district. So there's all sorts of, sort of nuances depending on the community and the demography, that is the state funding is producing these things, even though we don't initially see it as being that.
Yeah, doesn't it all go back to the state too? And the issue of segregation, that you talked about in Alabama, but also the issue of segregated school districts and where the school district boundaries are drawn. I think we have to kind of, it seems to me, I always, kind of have constantly reminding people when we talk about that, listen, the question of where district boundaries are drawn, whether they're county, municipal, how they're drawn, assignment policies, all of these are set in state capitals, aren't they?
Yeah.
So really, isn't the issue of segregated public schools by both race and poverty a state issue that the states are going to have to come to grips with if they're going to really build systems that serve all kids.
Yeah, I mean, of course, the great litigation in Connecticut, Sheffield O'Neill on this, and then Guzman in Minnesota, which you and I worked on an amicus there. I mean, that to me, that is the next step, right? Is that we bring this racial demography into the question of the state's responsibility, and you're doing great work. I think what might be one of the most important decisions that could come out of a state Supreme Court, hopefully this year, might be the biggest one in 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 years, is if the state of New Jersey would agree with your argument that ultimately it cannot simply authorize charters in New Jersey without any attention to the demographic effects of that, right? That we cannot separate money from demography. And we talk about being colorblind. Well, they can't be ELL blind either. They can't be SPED blind, right? There's all these different demographic groups, and we can't make some schools for the special ed kids and some for the ELL kids, but that's ultimately what your case shown has been happening in Newark and other places in New Jersey, and that's just as big a problem as money itself.
So let me we I have a couple more questions, and then we'll open it up to the audience. I would remind the audience, if you have a question that you'd like to ask, please put it in the chat box, and we'll try to get to them in a few minutes. I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. It's kind of not in your book directly, but well, before I do that, I do want to ask you, since we're here with public funds, public schools, what do you see? What's the threat of vouchers? I mean, you've been up on your high horse about vouchers, about Secretary DeVos and all of that recently. Why do you see vouchers? Why are vouchers a threat to not just public education, but to our democracy?
Yeah, well, I mean, a threat to public education, I think, for 2 reasons, is simply the siphoning of funds out of the public school system and putting them into a private school system. You could one elementary school could lose 20 kids, and that could be $300,000, but they lose 20 kids, the light bill still costs the same amount. They still have to hire the same number of teachers, same heating bills, same bus routes. The costs stay fixed, but they have less to do it with. So that's problem one. Problem two is a political problem, which goes back to the discussion we were having about pauper schools, that if you sort of make these schools, you sort of remove the politically influential people from public schools, then all of a sudden we have less political capital for public education. That's dangerous. And then third of all is the segregation, by religion and race when it moves into the private school system. And on top of that, all these federal and state statutes that we have to protect students in terms of due process and special education and LGBTQ, like all that stuff is gone in the private school system. So we are really releasing our children, or some of our children potentially, to the wolves or to segregated silos. So I see that as being the problem. And, that's a big democratic threat as well, right? I mean, the initial theory, going all the way back to John Adams in Massachusetts, was that we would bring everyone together around a common set of goals and a common good, and learn to find consensus, right? Learn to accept difference. And if there's anything that this country is missing right now, it is consensus and the ability to reach across difference. And our public schools is where that starts. And if we eliminate that from our society, I don't see how this incredibly diverse nation, one of the most diverse in the world and sort of geographically distinct, I don't see how we stick together, right, if we continue down this road over a period of time. So I think it's a serious threat to democracy as well.
So back on the voucher. So in some sense, what you're saying is that it can facilitate the exodus of students from the public school system, which in turn then undermines that political willingness, whether it's in Tallahassee or whatever, in the state capital, of legislatures to decide that they're going to raise taxes and increase investments and make investments in public schools that really don't serve the constituencies that they represent. Is that your point?
That's right. And I would add to that, which is, I think, something that we don't talk about, but think about it like an accountant. If you can get these children off your books, right, you have less financial debt or responsibility, right? And if you're just trying to lower taxes, that's one means to do it. And the other thing is when you stick a contractor with a job and tell them you're going to pay, $5,000, $6,000, like you can cap cost, you can keep it there, right? So when students are in the public school system, there's always the ability of an education law center to go in and say, look, costs have gone up, here are the needs of kids, et cetera, and that's your responsibility to meet that. When they're in the private system, they don't have that responsibility, at least in the direction we're going now. So you can imagine a world in which, Arizona says we're going to fund, or South Carolina, we're going to fund, private vouchers at $7,000 a pupil, which may sound somewhat attractive to some people today. But 10 years from now, it is still $7,000 a pupil. And some families are going to be able to supplement that to get something better. But everyone else is going to have to try to go out and buy whatever they can buy with $7,000. And, $7,000 in 2030 is not what $7,000 is in 2020. And so I do believe it will be that sort of slow way of getting not just students out of public schools, but reducing the state's financial responsibility to those children.
So two quick questions we talked about the voucher proponents and their recognition over the last 20 years, 30 years, that the place to get where they wanted to go was in the state legislatures. To get these legislatures and governors to support voucher programs, charter programs, things of that nature. What about on the flip side? What to you, Professor, does a progressive sort of pro-public school platform look like in a place like Arizona today or in South Carolina today? What do you want to see politicians who are running for the state Senate and state assembly talking about in terms of what they'll do for public education?
Well, I mean, this is work that you've been doing forever, but they all need to know what the cost of an adequate education is. And I would say that in a large number of those states, they have no clue. They just make up numbers every year, what we're willing to spend. So it has to be part and parcel every single year. You shouldn't be like funding an adequacy study every 10 years. You should have an office every year that sort of determines what's the cost, what's the needs, what's the projection. So, and once we get that number, that they have to fund it. And some people say, well, why would education get this sort of special sort of first in line that whatever they need, they get? Because that's what most of the state constitutions say, right? In Nevada, where you guys, won a case as well, the oddity was right. The first line item budget every year has to be for the public schools, not for fire, not for police, not for public schools, number one, right? And also in Pennsylvania, you cannot get into the budget process in Pennsylvania without passing your public education budget. So it is clear that it is supposed to be the first thing that's done. But what seems to be the case is that it is the leftover thing that's done most often. Like once they've dealt with all their pet projects, they spend whatever's left for public education. We have to reverse that. We have to reverse that scenario. And, we have to tackle these hard questions of race, which are not easy, but, it's not just money. It is segregation and inequality. And we have to start talking about how we draw district lines that don't incentivize segregation and exacerbate it.
Great. So I've been told we've got a bunch of questions here, and I have more, but I'm gonna stop. We can take it up in our next therapy session. But there's a question about DeVos here, and the questioner writes that her aim has always been to create more opportunity to use public funds to access religious schooling. And she says Christian, to be specific. What do you think about that? What do you think about her and the angle of making it less about that and more about race? And supposed advocacy for people of color. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just quickly say, James Foreman wrote a great article on this 15 years ago that talked about why vouchers were going nowhere, and it was that the religious right was trying to sort of put African Americans out front as the the reason why we had to do this, but the African American community wasn't behind it. There is probably more African American support for it now than there was then, but they've always tried to put another face out in front to do their agenda. I think the thing that I talk about in the book is that that's even more disingenuous now than it ever was, because at least we could say with the original voucher programs, they had income limits on them and there was a limited number of them. But in Florida, you don't get to $1 billion of vouchers by just giving it to poor kids, right? They're sort of raising income eligibility limits and eliminating them in some states. So what used to be for poor kids has become an agenda for wealthier folks. And ALEC basically announced, I think 3 years ago, that they were going to stop pushing this sort of poor kids agenda and just come clean, because I guess they had enough people in power in places like Arizona and elsewhere. They didn't think they needed a charade anymore. So I think what has not become as much of a conversation is the question that the person asked is, well, what's the religious angle there? And obviously DeVos has a religious angle that isn't just about, well, I don't know how much it's about wealth or not wealth, but in any event, she's adding a religious element too. But I think keeping that a little bit quieter, I think, than the question.
Do you have any brief comment on the Supreme Court's recent decisions in Trinity Lutheran and Espinoza, and what those mean for the states?
Well, what is it? I think that affects about, I wrote it in my new case book. I think that decision, which says that if you have this sort of prohibition on funding of private religious schools, that is a violation of free exercise clause. Some states, including South Carolina, prohibit funding of private or public, and so Espinoza doesn't really matter for us. And some of those states, have already made accommodations that before Espinoza came along. So honestly, I think it's a huge symbolic sort of win for them. It's sort of a shot in the arm to make them go for more. But heck, they're winning like gangbusters there in Florida and elsewhere before Espinoza. So not a good decision, but I don't see that as being the end of the world. I mean, I think it's a problematic decision. I think it misconstrues the history in a lot of these states. And I'll just say quickly, I mean, one reason why some of them said no religious schools is because those were the only private schools out there, right? And so there's this clear conversation in a lot of these states about they didn't want competition between private religious schools and the public schools. They just as easily could have, and maybe religion was part of that wedge too, but there was clear concerns about depriving the public schools of money, and so it wasn't just religion, but the court struck it down nonetheless in Espinoza. And I think your brief was great in sort of pointing out that the history is a lot more complicated than the Supreme Court made it out to be.
Somebody asked about COVID and vouchers, and talking about the stories, and this is from Colorado on pods. People getting together to have their own sort of mini private schools, I guess. I don't know too much about it. I've seen some stories about it, but is there a concern that do you have any concerns that the pandemic can be used in ways that could sort of advance the privatization agenda?
Well, yeah, I mean, this is almost advertisement for you guys, but which is good, and public funds for public schools, but that's what they've been doing, right? They have leveraged this pandemic to expand private schools. When Congress passed the CARES Act, right, sending money out for public schools and emergency funds that governors could use to adjust for ongoing needs, I think Congress and even I thought, my gosh, Betsy DeVos is awful, but at least for this period of time, she will put privatization aside for a moment and just do her damn job, right? The law says what it says, just do it. And I guess that just shows how naive I am. You probably weren't that naive, David, but that shows how naive I was. That it didn't take her but a week or so, and she's already cooking up plans, for micro vouchers and coordinating with governors, and then passing the guidance saying give more money to private schools. So they have tried to exploit this pandemic to drive more money to the private schools, and thanks to Public Funds for Public Schools and others, and Javier Becerra in California for helping block at least part of that. But it's kind of amazing. And the other thing that's happened is the demonization of public schools to also help sort of further that agenda, right? That by July, all of a sudden, COVID was the public schools' fault, right? That they don't want to do their job. We've got COVID under control. They won't open up. They're holding back the economy. Make it all their fault. DeVos is threatening, although she had no authority, she and the president are threatening, public schools, federal funds. And they're creating this narrative that establishes the predicate for why we ought to spend more money on private schools and less on public. And, we've seen, families leave, those higher income families leave, whether it be on their own dime or the state's dime. And that worries me. I think, Dr. Weber there in New Jersey had said they'll be back, right, as soon as the schools are open. I hope he's right. It does worry me, though, that the more well-to-do families that exit the public school system and they kind of like it for whatever reason, and maybe good reasons, maybe bad reasons, and then next year, they like vouchers a little bit more and they want the legislature to sort of permanently fund that. And that's certainly what the plan has been here in South Carolina. So I do have serious fears that this pandemic is demonizing schools in an unfair way and also creating a new constituency for private schools because, DeVos and Trump and some governors are creating a false narrative, I believe.
Right. And again, one of the things I want to say about the pandemic is that the states have been left off the hook again, right? So they made the decision to close schools. And when they did that, so a lot of the resource deficiencies and the funding deficiencies you talk about in your book sort of became so clear now, right? The digital divide, the buildings that don't have ventilation, HVAC, all of that, so forth and so on, that sort of exacerbating the pre-existing, if you will, conditions of underfunding, under-resourced schools, segregated schools. So we've sort of let the states off the hook in terms of their obligation to run these systems, haven't we?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I had a thing in the Washington Post at the beginning of COVID that said, 20 some odd states haven't even gotten back in terms of funding to the place they were before the last recession. And when the last recession hit, that's not to say they had adequate funding then. So some of them were subpar then. They went even more subpar following the recession. And now we have this, raising costs and driving down revenues. So, kids are at a double or triple disadvantage, I think, right now as compared to where they were, 10, 15 years ago. And so, it's getting worse and worse in a lot of communities. And of course, and because of that, the teacher pipeline is drying up as well, which is a serious problem.
I have a question here from Chris Nordstrom, our friend who does terrific work at the North Carolina Justice Center. Chris asks, Derek, from a messaging standpoint, any advice on how to succinctly push back on the argument that money should follow the child?
Succinct.
That's a favorite one of the privatization crowd. So take that one.
Yeah, well, ultimately, I mean, I can't say succinct. I'm just sort of, I haven't, but what I would say is, number one, we don't want a system where kids move around and we have segregation. We've talked about that with vouchers. But number two, even though we fund schools based upon head counts, I think those are sort of place markers in some respect, because it's, the state is ultimately just saying this is how much we're going to spend on public education this year, and we'll just divvy it up based upon head counts. If there were fewer students in the public schools, I think the per pupil number would just go up. That's hard to imagine, but that it would just go up. So I think that sort of idea that this money is just moving based upon kids is slightly flawed. And this came up, David, I was talking to you about it recently. It's come up with maybe it's in Milwaukee or sort of in Wisconsin, that this year the head counts are off, for that matter, because of the pandemic and people are doing home learning. Is the state going to all of a sudden take a bunch of money and move it around in the state because some kids have disappeared, or are they just going to try to keep it where it was based upon last year's numbers? So I mean, it's not succinct, but and I actually would be interested to hear David's response. But I think we use head counts because that's just a number we have, but it's not, there's never been this sense that each individual child is entitled to a specific amount of money.
Right. I'm going to go back to vouchers real quick. There is a question that somebody asked that I think is an important one, which is, Derek, is there any evidence in states that vouchers, savings accounts, or these sorts of schemes save money for the public school system?
Not that they say, not that they save money, no. I think it is a little bit harder to do the analysis. And, we had a meeting in Colorado, probably a lot of people on this call were there. I think we do a lot more research on that. I think you can track the sort of money drain with charter schools a lot easier because the money's coming directly out of the public school budget. Whereas in Florida, for instance, they're funding it through a tax credit schemes that, you see money getting bigger in one pot over here for the savings account, and you see money getting smaller in the public school account, but the money isn't directly coming out of the public school account. And so it gets a little bit trickier in figuring out that flow. But what I have in the book is to say you clearly see a trajectory of public school funding going down in Florida per pupil, and you see, vouchers and credit, tax credits and ESAs going up. So what you really have to do is sort of map trajectories, even though the money isn't always coming directly out of the public school funds.
So we have a little bit of time left. I got to ask a couple questions about the courts, one that's been asked here and one that I'm going to ask. So you talk in the book about the courts quite a bit, the state courts, and you describe them as helping the nation rediscover, is the word you use, the constitutional right to education, particularly after the Rodriguez decision, as many of those of you on the call know. Rodriguez was the U.S. Supreme Court decision back in the early 70s that essentially closed the courthouse doors to claims of inadequate or unequal education in the states as not being violative of equal protection or due process under the U.S. Constitution. And you, in your book, walk through a number of principles that the state courts have elucidated or defined or clarified, such as that the states are responsible, districts are creatures for the state, they can't delegate their responsibility, so forth and so on. But I want to press you a little bit. As a practical matter, what can the courts really do about remedying? What's their role, if you will, in actually trying to get to remedying some of the problems that you talk about, whether it's inadequate funding or segregated public schools? What can they do? And I ask that because we know that in the state system of government, it's the elected branches of government that the legislature and the governor, legislature in particular, that's has sole responsibility for appropriating funds. So what's the proper role of the courts? How should we be thinking about them here in state courts now?
Yeah, well, I mean, the proper role of the courts is to enforce the Constitution. And if the Constitution, mandates a result for children, then it is their obligation to call out and declare unconstitutional state failures to do that, and to order states to come up with a solution when they fail. Now, as to that solution, every state's different, but, courts, generally speaking, just as it was with school desegregation too, right, where there was even less separation of power issues, they said, look, the school district gets the sort of first shot at this. It's not as though the federal courts are the education experts of the world. So the school gets to go first. But when the school, at least in school desegregation, failed with its duty, then the federal courts kicked in and said, okay, it's our turn to tell you what to do. Now, our state courts haven't been quite as forceful, but I think what you really see is we'll let you have one shot, and they'll let you have two shots, and let you have three shots. I guess the difficult question is, how many shots should a state legislature get before a state Supreme Court steps in and says, no more shots, it must be this amount of money, right? I think a federal court would do that. Not obviously these are state courts, but a federal court, because they're insulated from elections and insulated from that relationship at the state level, would ultimately do something like that. But you know as well as I do, a lot of these state judges are elected, and we saw them unelected in Ohio a long time ago. We saw them unelected in Alabama, and so some of them walk a tight rope in terms of how specific they will or can be in terms of mandating a result. But what they can do, I remember long time ago, first education law conference I went to that you and Mike Rebell were running back in 2000 or something like that. Tim Hogan from from Arizona was coming in. Of course, that was in federal courts, but he was saying hold the whole state in contempt, shut the whole system down. I want an injunction. If you aren't going to operate a constitutional system, shut the whole darn thing down. That happened in New Jersey, back in the 70s, I believe, as well. So I think although a state court it's difficult for them to mandate a very specific result, they can hold legislators in contempt. They can enjoin the system. That's a high stakes game of chicken, but ultimately that has been the only way to get some state legislators' attention. And it's sad that you have to go that far, but sometimes you do.
So is it fair to say that that courts, the role of the courts, if they're going to get engaged, if they do get engaged, which many states courts have, is really to apply political pressure, and sometimes intense, to the elected branches of government to get them over the sort of legislative finish line? Is that kind of what you're talking about?
Yeah, that's right. And Charles Sable wrote a wonderful article about school finance overall about a decade or 2 decades ago. And he said, look, ultimately what school finance litigation does in a lot of states is give people a seat at the table that they'd never been invited to before. Does that guarantee we're going to get adequate and equal education? No, but it at least forces their issues and consideration of their constitutional rights to finally be part of the calculus of coming up with a budget, when in fact it had not been part of the calculus at all previously.
Right. And there's a question here. I'm going to sort of make it as a statement that's come up about Rodriguez and whether the federal courts, we should go back to the federal courts. I know you and I have talked about this. I know I'm not going to lay out my feelings on this, but the question is about, is there any, obviously the Supreme Court is not favorable at the moment. Is the federal courts a non-starter is the question here for the foreseeable future?
Yeah.
Our last question, if you both have some closing remarks on that one.
Yeah, it is a non-starter now. I mean, I'll just say that when people thought Hillary Clinton was going to win, including myself, when the presidency and Scalia's seat was open, and we could envision some various great jurists there, and they filed in Detroit. You could have imagined something big and important happening there, but no, it is a non-starter at this point, it seems to be.
So the bottom line is the federal courts and perhaps even the federal government is not going to come in to save the day. Ultimately, the work has to be done state by state by state, and primarily in our state capitals. I think that's my parting point to all of this.
Well, I will say, David, though, as one, you gave me a little bit of an opening. I got to help Elizabeth Warren's campaign come up with a sort of funding proposal there. And what I said was that the federal government should triple or quadruple its investment in public schools. But different than what Biden's talking about, there should be very specific conditions on that money. And that was to say that, look, you can have this money, but at the end of the day, you have to each year make progress on closing funding gaps and making it more progressive each year. And I actually do think if the feds put a big chunk of money out there and kind of said there has to be a certain amount of progress made each year for you to get this money, I do think we could see tremendous movement in the states in terms of making their funding formulas more progressive than what they are.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up as an ending note, the need for underlining progressive federal education policy that really not just hands money over to the states, but moves them forward to address some of these underlying structural deficits that are driven by race and class in the states and then the history of the state, so forth and so on. That would be an enormous help if we could get the federal government or get Congress to do that. So I can't agree with you more on that. So Jessica, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Thanks, David. Thanks. That's a wonderful note to end. Thank you so much to David Chiara and Professor Derek Black for joining us to talk about your new book, which is essential reading for everyone who is concerned about making sure that public schools remain strong and get stronger along with our democracy. So Schoolhouse Burning, Public Education and the Assault on American Democracy is Derek Black's new book. And please remember to visit pfps.org to access our advocacy materials, including recordings of this webinar and other webinars, and to get info on our latest litigation, policy, and research work. Professor Black, thank you so much for joining us, and to David Chiara for moderating the discussion, and sign up for information on our next webinars and events. Look forward to seeing you all again soon.